So next up is we have a talk called "Using Accuracy and Realism to Attract New Gaming Audiences." So with that, I would love to introduce Alexander Winn from Edgeworks Entertainment, who will present this topic.
Hello.
Hello.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Go for it. I will excuse myself.
Let me just, when I got promoted to panelist, it rearranged my windows here real quick. All right. Yeah, so first off, thanks for having me. My name is Alexander Winn, and I'm going to be talking to you about my experience making a game called Terrigenesis, which I originally made and released in 2016 and is still going strong. So yeah, talking about some of the experiences that I've had working on that and finding some pretty surprising success for a game that a lot of people thought was going to be pretty niche. So first off, like I said, my name is Alexander Winn. I was just sort of a go into the office iOS developer. And in my spare time, I made other kinds of apps. I actually made 25 apps on the App Store. And my 25th was a game called Terrigenesis. And this was back in the summer of 2016. I released Terrigenesis. I had made it all by myself. And Terrigenesis is a game about the real science of landing on Mars and other planets, building cities, and eventually terraforming the planet. And if anybody here isn't familiar with the phrase with the word terraforming, terraforming is where you take a planet like Mars or the moon, where you need a spacesuit to survive, and you thicken the atmosphere, you add oxygen, you add water, and the goal is to eventually turn it into a planet like Earth, where you can just live out in the open. So Terrigenesis is a game about terraforming Mars and other planets. Originally released the summer of 2016, and to be perfectly honest, even I didn't actually think that it was necessarily going to be that huge. I wanted to play it, but you know, I'm a nerd. So, but when we released it, when I released it, we ended up getting such an incredible response, and we have ever since. We actually got over 1 million downloads in our first year, just on iOS. My wife and I ended up starting a company called Edgeworks Entertainment. We hired a couple of more developers and some marketing people. We ended up signing with a publisher, and now 4 years later, we have passed 17 million downloads on iOS and Android, and we just recently came to Windows. So it's been a really wild ride, but it's been an absolute dream come true. And one of the things that always surprises people about Terrigenesis and sort of delights the audiences, but surprises the game industry people, is how much real science there is in Terrigenesis. You know, we have all of the surface maps of the different planets are actual maps based on NASA data. All of the surface stats, like temperature and air pressure, oxygen levels, are all based on how things really are. We measure everything using real units. You know, when you thicken the atmosphere of Mars, you're aiming for 100,000 pascals of pressure. Why? Because Earth's atmosphere is 100,000 pascals. It was really important to me when I was developing it to base everything in how this really works. And that has become, since the success of Terrigenesis, really sort of the guiding light of our entire company, is injecting authenticity and realism into our games and our other products. And we have found that that really increases the size of the audience and the passion with which our audience responds to our products. So it's something that I've started kind of going out and telling people about, because I really think that this is something that a lot of people have a misunderstanding around. That if something is based on real science, that it's edutainment, that it's necessarily going to be kind of boring, or that it's necessarily for kids or aimed for educational spaces and that sort of thing. And really, it's not. Ever since Terrigenesis came out, I've been telling people it's really not. You can do large scale things like the gameplay of Terrigenesis, where, you know, the core gameplay is based on real science, or you can even just do little Easter eggs all throughout the game. And that kind of thing really can energize your audience. So that's the premise that I'm going to be talking about right now, that authenticity and nuance on the subject matter of your game can really help increase the size of your audience and also increase engagement within that audience. And now, this isn't really a new idea. Whenever I say this to people, they always get a little dubious. But really, in certain areas, everybody's on the same page about this. And the first one that is really obvious to a lot of people is historical games and movies and TV shows and everything. If something is based on a true story, people want to know, is it accurate? That's one of the first things they reach for is, did you do it right? You know, oftentimes when we see a movie or a video game based on real history, people won't even talk about whether it's good or bad. They'll talk about whether it's right or wrong. You know, if you make a movie set in World War II and such battle plays out in a way that is not how it played out in real history, people have a problem with that. And you'll get called out for that because people see an inherent value in the accuracy of that kind of thing. And you can look in the video game world at the Assassin's Creed franchise is probably the best example of this. They have, you know, every Assassin's Creed game is set in a different historical era, and every single one has dozens or scores of real historical characters that are often represented very accurately. Despite the fact that Assassin's Creed is a sci-fi franchise, basically, they really put a lot of work into rendering the environments and rendering the characters with a lot of authenticity. Another great example is HBO's Rome, which walks us through the lives of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar and all their contemporaries. And again, the fact that this is what really happened lends that show a lot of gravitas. Another one that I point out to a lot of people is The West Wing, which is not really a historical show, but the fact that it deals with how government really works is another example of, you know, you can look at any number of political TV shows that don't have that kind of authenticity, that don't get into how certain committees work and that sort of thing. And they just don't work as well. They don't have the kind of gravitas that The West Wing has. And then the last example that I'll toss out for history is the musical Hamilton, which is obviously not at all historically accurate in certain respects, but there are a lot of lyrics in the songs of Hamilton that are pulled straight from the historical record. And again, it gives it a lot of gravitas. Another example that's closer to the video game industry of this kind of thing is licensed IPs. So when people talk about, hey, they're making a new Batman video game, or hey, you know, Spider-Man on PS4 and that sort of thing, people want accurate representations of these worlds. They want to see Arkham Asylum as they have imagined it. And if the creators take too much license, it starts to turn people off. The authenticity is part of the selling point. And again, licensed IPs in other mediums, the Harry Potter movies were often lauded for how accurate they were to the books. You can just look at Lord of the Rings versus The Hobbit and how people responded to those film adaptations. One of them was a lot closer to the books and people responded to it. And again, in the video game world, even areas like, one of the reasons that SimCity had the staying power it did is because it was about urban planning. It wasn't just some weird resource management system. It made you feel like you were really building a city. And you had to deal with stuff like plumbing. You had to deal with the electrical grid. You had to deal with crime rates and all that sort of thing. It didn't get in the way of gameplay. It informed gameplay. And so that's what Terrigenesis does for science and astronomy. And we're not the only ones. Another example is Kerbal Space Program. Kerbal Space Program has built a lot of its brand on the realistic engineering, that you are building real rockets, that you are building things that could actually fly. And you're facing a lot of the challenges that NASA actually faces. And really, at its core, that's all that gaming is, gameplay is facing challenges. And so, as much fun as it is to invent a new scenario like Mario, there are things out in the world that present challenges as they are. And that was what we tried to capture with Terrigenesis. But with all of these examples, the effect is always the same. the people respond to the authenticity. And what we've seen with Terrigenesis is that people really get excited about the real science. And every time we roll out a new update that brings more realism, we see a spike in engagement. So for example, just last week, we rolled out a new update that included lava. For the first time in Terrigenesis, if you heat your planet up beyond a certain point, it's gonna start to melt. You can actually return the Earth to a molten state. And players went nuts for it. It doesn't really inform the core gameplay of Terrigenesis. It doesn't really influence any of the existing things that you do in the game, but the fact that it allows you to play out a scenario that can actually exist, that players can play out this idea and see how it would really work, even within the context of a mobile game, they get really excited. The other thing that we've seen that is hugely beneficial is we get entirely new audiences. I can't tell you how many people of the 17 million players that we've had over the last 4 years have messaged us and said, this is my first video game ever. I'm not only not a hardcore gamer, I'm a 75-year-old man or a 14-year-old girl who has never played a video game before in my life. But I love astronomy. I love space. And so I wanted to play this. There are plenty of instances of teachers who have emailed us and said, I use your game in my classroom. And again, Terrigenesis is not edutainment. I didn't set out to make a game that was educational for its own sake. This is about using the realism to enhance the gameplay experience. And one example that I've used several times in the past is the movie Apollo 13. When Ron Howard was making Apollo 13, he was really worried about how to do zero-G, how to portray people in space so that they're floating around. And the story is that he reached out to Steven Spielberg and said, well, how would you approach this? And they heard about a jet that you can actually hire that will fly up and up and up and up and up and then just go into free fall. And for about 23 seconds, you're in zero-G. And that's how they filmed Apollo 13. It was a lot more expensive, but it lent this feeling of authenticity that you were watching Tom Hanks float around in zero-G, and it made the product better. The fact that it was authentic and accurate made it more entertaining. And that's the thing that I keep trying to drive home that so many people wrestle with because it doesn't feel like it would be true that something that is accurate and educational is also more fun, but it really is. And ever since Terrigenesis came out, it's been 4 years, there have been other games about landing on Mars, about building cities on Mars. Games like Surviving Mars. There's another one called Planet Base. There are several out there that involve transforming planets or building cities on other planets. But what you'll notice is that they often have a fairly cartoony art style. And that is another thing that our players have really said, is that they value the gravitas. They value the fact that this is taken seriously because they want to take it seriously. They like the idea of landing on Mars. And so they want to play out how that would really feel. The sort of the Buck Rogers experience of the curvy spaceship and the family of 4 in their shiny silver spacesuits is kind of played out. People want to know what it would really be like. And so approaching it from this realistic standpoint adds a lot of value to the player without really taking much from the developer. There's one of my favorite quotes of all time is from Winston Churchill. And he says, I love to learn, but I hate being taught. And I feel like that's how a lot of people these days feel, is they've got sort of low-grade PTSD from their school days about being taught. And a lot of them have internalized the idea that they're bad at science or they're bad at math. And so the whole idea of math or science stresses them out. They don't want to go there. So they would have no interest in an educational game about Mars. But if you present it as fun, if you present it as just another game like SimCity was fun, yeah, let's check it out. The amount of enjoyment that they can get from that feeling of how it really works, they're not being taught. They're learning without being taught. And that has huge value, both from a gameplay standpoint, but also from the ability to influence the world. I can't tell you how many people we have, I mean, literally scores of people we've gotten emails and letters from who have said, I changed my major. I'm a college student and I changed my major because of Terrigenesis. This kind of thing really influences people's lives because it's real. And that is just the most exciting feeling. So a few examples of how we do this in Terrigenesis. It's available as a free download on iOS and Android and the Windows Store, or the Microsoft Store, so feel free to check it out. But just to give you some examples, like I said, we use real maps for Mars and all the other planets from NASA. NASA is a public domain agency, so you can just use NASA textures. Go play a bunch of games set on Mars, and you would be surprised how few of them actually have a location on Mars. Generally, you're just playing on a generic rolling red landscape. And yeah, it's red, so sure, Mars, but it could just as easily be Arizona. But we use real maps. You know, these are the real surface features of Mars. We use real units of measurement, like I was saying. We measure the temperature in millikelvins. We measure the oxygen level in parts per million. The facilities that you build in Terrigenesis are all based on real ideas that have been floated by NASA or SpaceX. We even, when NASA discovered a new system of Earth-like planets called TRAPPIST-1, we even added TRAPPIST-1 as playable worlds in the game. We're always looking for new ways to bring that sense of authenticity to the game. And it has absolutely paid off. So, like I said, I'm spreading the word to any developer I can that this is real potential. So the last thought that I'll share with you here is one of the ways that I've started thinking about this is everybody understands viscerally in the entertainment industry the value of a licensed IP. I think if you walked up to any indie developer and said, hey, we're interested in giving you the rights to Star Wars. Do you want it? Or we're interested in giving you the rights to the Marvel universe. Do you want it? Pretty much everyone would say yes, because not only are they probably fans, but because they recognize the value of that IP. They recognize that it will bring in players who like Star Wars, and then they can fall in love with your game. It's a way of getting people in the door. And the way I've started describing this is, if I told you that there was an IP out there that had hundreds of fully fleshed out characters that people already know about and already enjoy, that had all sorts of scenarios and all sorts of storylines already written for you, and you could license it for free, I think most people would jump at that chance. And it's true. The IP that you can license is the real world, is history, is science, is all of these different areas that people act like are intimidating. But man, none of us have ever played a video game as challenging as landing on Venus would be. And nobody has ever tapped so many corners of Earth's history. You know, if you're gonna make a game set in the Middle Ages, why make the main character some generic knight in shining armor? Make it Charles the Hammer Martel, the hammer of Christendom. Like, this guy already exists and you can just use him. It's not an IP that you have to license. You know, how many games have we seen that are based in Greek and Roman and Egyptian and Norse mythology? Nobody touches Aztec mythology or Japanese mythology or Maori mythology. All of these areas are just open and ready to be used, ready to be brought to the players, and you don't have to buy them. It's tons of free content. The only requirement is that you represent them authentically. And if you do, I am living proof that players will respond. So that's my message. Looks like we've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, so it's your preference. Do you want to read them yourself, or you want me to read them to you?
Looks like we've got a couple here.
Yeah, we've got 4 questions now.
So, which other projects would you like to see this realistic approach applied? What world or system would you love to realize? To be honest, there are so many different ones. If you start looking into history or looking into science, I mean, I'm big on space, as you can tell from the background. literally just pick a planet or moon, and there's something fascinating about it. You know, Mercury rotates at about the speed of a brisk walk, which means you can literally outrun the sunrise. And you'd better, because it's so close to the sun that it will kill you if the sun is able to fully rise. How has nobody made a free running game set on Mercury, where if you slow down too much, the sun's gonna catch up to you? You know, Venus is ready to kill you at any moment. The Io, the moon of Jupiter, has 150 volcanoes erupting every second of every day. Just pick a planet or moon, and there is something interesting about it. And then the same thing with history. You know, we've gotten so many movies and TV shows and video games set in European history. But I promise, there are just as many interesting stories in Indian history, or African history, or Chinese history. It doesn't have to be a political statement to make a show or a video game that isn't European. There's interesting stuff. There's so many characters from these other parts of the world that no one is doing. You would be the only game in town if you made a game about Incan mythology. No one would be competing with you. So you could do that, or you could make another game about Greek mythology, which everyone is doing. And that's just an obvious choice. The only thing you have to do is learn enough about Incan mythology to make an interesting game. So really, it's just a matter of kind of throw a dartboard at, you know, a school curriculum or a map of the world, and you can find interesting things. Let me see. Does Alexander think the same appeal helps AAA series like Assassin's Creed succeed? Does that appeal to non-gamers who happen to love pirates and Greek myths? Absolutely. I can tell you for sure that some of my friends never played a video game until, you know, Assassin's Creed Origins, because they love ancient Egypt. That kind of thing, I think, is a big part of why Assassin's Creed is Assassin's Creed. There are plenty of other games that have pretty much the same mechanic as Assassin's Creed, but this one has history. And every time a new game is announced, people get excited about where's this one gonna be set? Ooh, I think the next one's gonna be Vikings. Oh, that's cool. You know, that becomes a part of the franchise. And you can look at games like Shadow of Mordor, which in many ways is very similar to Assassin's Creed in its gameplay mechanics. But that one has authenticity, more or less, to the Lord of the Rings franchise. Assassin's Creed has authenticity to history. And again, the Lord of the Rings franchise, somebody had to write. History, you just have to go look it up. It's written for you. Let's see here. Tweens and children more in 6 to 12 years also need exposure to realistic games. Tweens seem to prefer faster paced gameplay. How are you addressing the tween audience for Terrigenesis? To be perfectly honest, Terrigenesis is what I call a Goldilocks game. The idea is balancing things between different poles. So the idea is that a planet that's too cold is no better than a planet that's too hot. You need it to be right in the middle. So Terrigenesis can be as fast-paced as you want it to be. The faster you play it, the swingier it is and the harder it is. The more patient you are, the easier it is to kind of hit the mark. So it can be fairly fast-paced. I think it's all just comes down to what kind of game you want to make. You know, pretty much any genre can be applied to anything aside from probably platformers. But you know, if you're making an action game, if your character is swinging swords, that can be applied just as easily to European history as it can be to any other part of history. So yeah. How long do we have? Is it 10:45 or?
Yeah, we still have time actually. We've got about 6-7 more minutes to go.
Yeah.
More like 5 or 6 minutes, but yeah.
Okay. So one person says, when you make an aspect of games extremely realistic, for example, graphics, you run the risk of making them bland and anonymous. There was a big splurge of very realistically brown-looking games in the 2000s. How do you tell when the realism is actually fun and not just correct? That's a really good question. The thing that I have often found is if you are making it realistic in a way that isn't fun, then you're focusing on the wrong kind of realism. One good example is in games like Assassin's Creed, Odyssey, or Red Dead Redemption, you end up riding a horse a lot. if you have to like feed your horse at a realistic pace, if the map was actually the size of the American West so that it took you 2 weeks to ride across to the other side of the map, that's not fun. That is focusing on realism for realism's sake. The kind of realism that I'm talking about is more reaching back for things that can inform gameplay. So for example, in Terrigenesis, we have, as you thicken the atmosphere, it also warms up the planet. That's why Venus is so hot. So that kind of thing can inform gameplay. If I were to tell a game designer, hey, Venus and Mars have very different gravity levels, instantly, any game designer worth their salt starts thinking of, ooh, that would be interesting. How can that inform gameplay? This mission takes place on Venus. This mission takes place on Mars. The gravity is lower on Mars. What can we do with that? That's the kind of thing where you're reaching for authenticity in a way that informs the experience and makes it more interesting. So that I think is the key. If you look at, and it's especially easy to see parallels with history, because at the end of the day, a battle in Europe in the Middle Ages is not that different from a battle in China in the Middle Ages or a battle in Iran in the Middle Ages. There are specifics that change, but if you have a game mechanic that is fun for deploying troops or swinging a sword, it can be used just as well for swinging, a greenstone club in New Zealand. So yeah, that kind of thing is very, can be used to inform gameplay rather than to dull it down. Because I agree, it is possible to do authenticity in a way that is lame. And then it looks like we've got 2 more. One that says, why do you think the developers tend to focus on fantasy and fiction than real life? Is there some kind of fear? Yes, I think it's twofold. First, I think that a lot of people just don't know. If I were to say, hey, what's the most interesting character from, Europe in the Middle Ages? I think a lot of people would reach for specific characters. Some of them are mythological, like Robin Hood or King Arthur. But, people have heard of Richard the Lionheart. People have heard of, those kind of people. But people don't really know that much about, the figures of African history or the figures of Indian history or Native American history. And so a lot of the time, I think it's just that they don't realize it. Everybody knows Zeus and Hera and Dionysus and Hephaestus and Athena. Not very many people know about Ishtar and Baal. So they just don't have those ideas. But the other side, I think, is this fear that authenticity is a turnoff, that realism will scare people away. And that is the thing that I've sort of made it my life's mission to dispel. Because there are so many examples, especially if you widen your view outside of just video games. You look at movies like The Martian, was incredibly science heavy and incredibly jargon heavy. And yet it was also so much fun. You did not need a PhD to watch The Martian. And the same thing with Assassin's Creed. You could play multiple games of that franchise and never even recognize that the characters you're talking to are historical figures. But they are. And it's so much cooler when you realize that. Or if you come in with a little bit of pre-knowledge and you're like, holy crap, that's Calico Jack. I know him. It makes the whole experience more entertaining. And writing Calico Jack, programming Calico Jack into that video game was no harder than doing the same thing for a fictional character. It takes no extra effort and it adds a lot of value. So the last one.
Yeah, this is a big question. So, but we don't have much time for a big answer. So you may want to keep it quick.
So the question is, there are so many discussions about cultural appropriation. Is there any way developers can talk about different cultures and mythologies without being criticized? And the short answer is yes, involve them. For example, we have several characters of different nationalities in Terrigenesis. One of them is a Muslim woman from Syria, and we were discussing whether or not to have her wear a headscarf. And so we simply reached out to Muslim scholars and Muslim advisors. And they actually came back and said, no, that's actually, at this point, it's kind of a stereotype. It would be kind of refreshing to see a Muslim woman who doesn't wear that. And so she doesn't have it in the game. In the same way, we reached out to some Maori advisors when naming some of our Polynesian characters, that sort of thing. So the trick with appropriation is when you do it wrong. And the easiest way to not do it wrong is to involve the experts.
Yeah, excellent, excellent answer. And as a geographer who does culturalization work in this industry, yeah, I very much appreciate that. So,
Yeah,
yeah, great topic. That was
thank you.
fantastic. So, so yes, thank you. And we are going to move on. And if you have additional questions for Alexander, please follow up with him. And like I mentioned before, we have a Discord channel where speakers and others are in there having all kinds of follow-up discussions. So please take advantage of it.